At the beginning of the century, the most powerful empire in the world looked at its navy, its trade routes, its industrial strength, and its colonies spread across the globe, and quietly realized a truth that was deeply unsettling. Coal had built the British Empire, but they were starting to feel that it might no longer be enough to keep it standing. Because the coming war would not just be about ships, land, and manpower, it was now about fuel, speed, logistics, and how effectively a state could run its machines before its entire system began to break down. So the real question was this: could you keep modern machines running fast enough, far enough, and long enough? That's why seeing World War I as just the last great imperial war of the Old World fall short, because it was also the first global oil war. Welcome to a story where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is as simple as it seems. To understand why oil became so critical, we need to go back to just before the war, to a time when the world was still running on coal. Back then, coal was everything. It powered factories, ran the railways, moved trade fleets, and even fueled the massive warships of the era. Britain had plenty of coal, and that was one of the main reasons it dominated the 19th century. But oil offered something coal simply couldn't. It carried more energy for the same weight, could be loaded faster, gave ships quicker acceleration, required fewer workers, and provided a level of speed and flexibility that coal-powered fleets just couldn't match. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill made the decision to switch the Navy to oil, even though Britain wasn't exactly comfortable in terms of oil supply. In 1914, Parliament agreed to invest in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and the state stepped directly into the game to secure fuel for the Navy. This wasn't a minor detail, it was the state openly accepting that energy had become a matter of national security. And this is exactly where the real story begins. Because when a navy, an army, or an entire economy restructures itself around a new energy source, it doesn't just change fuel, it rewrites its foreign policy. Which lands matter, which companies become critical, which sea routes are indispensable, and which distant crisis suddenly becomes vital, all of it changes. A pipeline in Iran or an oil field in the Gulf could now become just as important to London as a shipyard in Portsmouth. Oil turned geography into strategy at an incredible speed and made distant places feel uncomfortably close. This is one of the most hidden rules of modern power. When empires become dependent on a resource, that resource stops being local. First it becomes political, then military, and if necessary, even moral. When the war began in August 1914, Europe still looked like it was fighting an old world war, with railways, horses, and traditional armies still at the center. And in many ways, it actually was. But beneath the surface, things had already started to change. Trucks, cars, tanks, submarines, and aircraft were now dependent on oil. Mobility, range, and mechanized warfare were no longer ideas, they were reality. But that reality was complex, unreliable, and extremely fuel-hungry. The war started with coal, but it ended in a completely different energy world. Those who saw the future early understood this, and that future smelled like oil. This gave the Allies a major advantage because they controlled more than 70% of the world's oil production. And that matters because wars are not won by intelligence alone. Wars are won by the side that can keep machines running, sustain logistics, and hold the system together. Oil didn't replace everything, but it started determining who could move and who would get stuck. The Allies weren't smarter, they were just more prepared for the new energy order. And history is often that simple and that brutal. It's not the morally better side that usually ends up at the table. It's the one with stronger logistics. Britain realized this early in the Middle East. As soon as the Ottomans entered the war, the British quickly moved toward Mesopotamia. The logic was simple. The oil in Basra had to be protected. They launched a landing in 1914 and secured the region in a short time. This shows us something important. Wars are rarely as romantic as they are told. Before slogans and ideals, there is always a cold calculation. If oil matters, then the place where oil exists matters too. Suddenly, Mesopotamia stopped being just another place and became something tied directly to the future of the empire. The Central Powers were in the opposite situation. They had oil, but not enough, and much of it was under threat. That left them weak in the most critical area of modern warfare: sustained mechanical capacity. Fuel shortages mean fewer options, slower movement, and more limited operations. And most of the time you try to take what you don't have. That's why regions like Baku, Romania, and the Caucasus suddenly became critical. The war wasn't just fought in the trenches, it was also fought across the energy map. Romania is one of the clearest examples of this. Once it entered the war, oil became both a prize and a risk. As they retreated, they destroyed their own oil facilities so the enemy couldn't use them. But control kept changing hands. And in war, whoever controls fuel controls the tempo. And tempo often decides the outcome. The same pattern appeared with tanks. They were unreliable at first, but that wasn't the point. What mattered was that warfare itself was changing. And this new kind of war demanded fuel. Oil was often invisible, but its impact was everywhere. By 1918, this was completely clear. Oil was no longer an option, it was a necessity. But that doesn't mean it alone won the war. A more accurate way to put it is this: oil determined who could adapt to the new way of war. It didn't replace people, money, or power, but it connected all of them. That's why it's called a hidden war. Because oil was always there, but it was rarely talked about openly. Governments talked about other things, but the real issue was deeper: energy dependence and the strategic pressure that came with it. And there was also a financial side to it. The line between state and corporations started to blur. Markets were no longer just markets. They became extensions of policy. And the war left behind a major lesson. If oil shaped this war, it would shape the ones that followed. And it did. Even today, the logic hasn't really changed. Whatever a system depends on, it will use power to protect it, and it will usually describe that as stability. There's also a personal side to this. Real power is the system that can survive under pressure. The biggest mistakes are not wrong choices, but failing to see your dependencies. And most of the time, by the time you realize that, the game has already changed.